There's a small detail in Mark chapter 11 that most readers pass right over, and once you actually stop on it, the whole scene stops making easy sense. Jesus is walking from Bethany toward Jerusalem. He's hungry, and he sees a fig tree in the distance covered in leaves. He walks up to it looking for something to eat, finds nothing but leaves, and curses it so that it will never bear fruit again. Mark adds one line right after that curse, almost in passing, that it wasn't even the season for figs. That single sentence is the detail that changes how this whole story has to be read. Jesus curses a tree for not having fruit at a time when no fig tree in that region would have had fruit anyway. That's not an oversight in the text, and it's not a mistake that slipped past a careless writer. Mark knew exactly what he was writing. He wrote for a community that would have known fig season as well as they knew their own calendars. And he left that detail in on purpose because the fig tree was never really about figs. If it were only about a hungry man frustrated at an empty tree, the detail about the season would make Jesus look unreasonable, cursing a plant for something completely outside its control. That reading doesn't survive contact with the rest of the passage, and the church has never actually read it that way. Something else is happening underneath the surface of the story, and Mark is signaling to his readers, right from the first line, that they need to keep looking. Mark tells this story in a very specific shape, and the shape is doing a lot of the work. He starts the fig tree scene, then pauses it completely, and moves straight into Jesus entering Jerusalem and turning over the tables of the money changers in the temple. Only after that does he go back and finish the fig tree, showing the disciples the next morning that it had withered down to the roots. This kind of structure shows up a few times in Mark's Gospel, where one story gets split in half and another story gets placed right in the middle of it, almost like a frame built around a picture. It's not random editing, and it's not simply how the events happen to unfold chronologically. It's a literary technique, a way of telling the reader that the two events explain each other, that neither one is complete without the other sitting inside it. The fig tree isn't a separate incident that happens to sit near the temple story. It's wrapped around the temple story on purpose, so that whatever Jesus is doing to that tree, he's also saying about the temple standing right behind it. Once you see that structure, you can't really unsee it. The withering of the tree the next morning isn't a delayed footnote. It's the second half of a single message that Mark wants read as one continuous thought. Walk into the middle of that sandwich, and you find Jesus overturning tables, driving out people buying and selling, quoting the prophets back at the crowd, saying the house of God was meant to be a house of prayer, and had instead become something closer to a den of robbers. This wasn't Jesus objecting to commerce for its own sake, and it wasn't a spontaneous outburst of anger over minor corruption at the edges of temple life. The temple in Jerusalem was, at that point in its history, the center of national religious life, the place where sacrifice happened, where the whole system of approaching God was supposed to be centered, where the nation understood itself to be closest to the presence of God on earth. And by the time Jesus walks in, the outward system is running exactly as designed. The courts are full, the sacrifices are being sold, the rituals are being performed correctly, the priests are doing what priests are supposed to do. From a distance, it looks alive and functioning, covered in leaves, exactly the way that fig tree looked from a distance on the road that morning. Jesus goes looking for what that system was actually supposed to produce underneath all that activity, and doesn't find it. The structure is running. The purpose behind the structure is missing. So if the outward system was working exactly as it should, why would Jesus walk in and tear through it like that? This is where the fig tree stops being just a tree. In fig trees, leaves and fruit are meant to show up close together, so a tree in full leaf out of season was giving off a signal it couldn't back up. It looked like it had something to offer, and didn't. That's the exact picture Jesus is pointing at when he looks at the temple. Full appearance, empty substance. All the visible markers of devotion in place, and none of what those markers were supposed to represent actually there underneath. The fathers of the church who wrote about this passage read the tree as a picture of a certain kind of religious life, one that performs all the right actions and says all the right things while carrying nothing real inside it. Not people who reject God outright, not people who've walked away from faith entirely, but people who've built a convincing appearance of faith with no actual fruit growing out of it. That's a harder thing to catch in yourself than open unbelief, because it doesn't feel like failure from the inside. It feels like leaves. It looks like enough. A person can pray the right words, show up at the right times, keep every visible rule, and still be standing exactly where that tree was standing, green and full and completely without fruit, because none of those outward things were ever the point in themselves. They were only ever supposed to be signs pointing towards something real underneath them. If you're finding this useful, go ahead and subscribe, because there's more of this kind of digging into scripture coming, and you won't want to miss it. Put next to each other, the temple and the tree are making the same point from two different directions. A religious system or a person can go through every outward motion correctly and still be found without fruit when someone actually stops to look closely. The curse on the tree wasn't cruelty toward a plant that couldn't help the season it was born into. It was a warning dressed up as an event, aimed at anyone watching who assumed that looking devoted was the same thing as being fruitful. Mark places the withered fig tree right where he does, so that nobody reading it can miss what it's attached to, so that the temple scene and the tree scene sit locked together in the reader's mind, unable to be pulled apart and read separately. This is why the detail about the season matters so much. If the tree had simply failed at something it was supposed to do, the story would just be about a barren tree, a minor and easily explained agricultural disappointment, because it failed at something it was never able to do in the first place. The story becomes about something else entirely, about the gap between looking alive and actually bearing something real, a gap that has nothing to do with timing or season and everything to do with what's actually growing inside a person underneath whatever they show to everyone watching. That gap is the whole point, and it's the reason this small detail, easy to skip past, ends up carrying the weight of the entire passage, still asking the same question of anyone reading it now that it asked of everyone standing in that temple courtyard 2,000 years ago.